Americans like to think they have access to anything they crave, from stacked milkshakes to endless fast food chains. But the truth is, dozens of foreign foods remain illegal to import or sell in 2025. Some are banned for safety, some to save species, and some because of politics that sound ridiculous until you dig in. Over the next few minutes, you'll see examples of all three categories: health rules, conservation protections, and trade restrictions that still shape what ends up on American plates. And we'll start with a dish so tied to national pride that Scotland is still fighting for its return. Haggis, Scotland's lost dish. Imagine sitting down in Edinburgh with a plate of haggis, Scotland's national dish, only to find out that bringing it back to the United States is against the law. The recipe mixes oats, onions, suet, and sheep organs inside a stomach casing, boiled until it forms its dense, savory texture. But the part that makes it authentic is the very reason it can't cross American borders: sheep lung. In 1971, the U.S. Department of Agriculture issued a rule that banned the use of animal lungs in food. Regulators argued that lungs can trap fluids, making them harder to inspect for safety. Because traditional haggis depends on lung tissue, the dish was automatically locked out of U.S. imports. It wasn't about taste or cultural judgment, just a federal rule that has never been revised. Over the decades, Scotland hasn't stopped pushing back. Several times, government officials have lobbied American authorities to reconsider, pointing to advances in food testing and food safety standards. Still, the FDA and USDA have kept the same position for more than 50 years, leaving the ban firmly in place. What Scotland sees as heritage, America continues to view through the lens of regulation. For Scottish-American families, that means substitutes. You'll find versions made with beef liver, barley, or even turkey giblets standing in for the missing lung meat. These replacements are legal and sometimes convincing, but anyone raised on the original will tell you it's not quite the same. Celebrations like Burns Night in the US often feature these workarounds, but the real dish stays on the other side of the Atlantic. Haggis shows how a single safety rule can erase a tradition from American tables. But not every food ban is about health regulations. Some are about protecting something far larger than a single recipe, entire species pushed to the brink by demand. Beluga Caviar, luxury that's off the table. Beluga caviar may be the textbook definition of decadence, but in the United States, it has been off the market since 2005. That was the year the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service imposed a full import ban in response to collapsing wild populations of the beluga sturgeon, the immense Caspian Sea fish that produces these prized eggs. A single adult can grow longer than a pickup truck and weigh hundreds of pounds. Yet despite its size, the species became one of the most heavily exploited animals in the global food trade. The biology of the beluga makes recovery especially difficult. Female sturgeon often require decades before reaching reproductive maturity, and once numbers fall, the population takes many years to rebuild. Coupled with escalating demand for luxury caviar through the 20th century, that slow life cycle left belugas highly vulnerable. By the early 2000s, conservation groups were sounding alarms about steep declines, and regulators responded with the 2005 Prohibition that remains in force today. That decision dampened, but did not eliminate demand. Smuggling networks still seek profit from a product that sells at especially high prices on the black market. Law enforcement continues to target illegal shipments with raids and seizures, treating the trade as a serious conservation issue. Chefs and importers caught sneaking it into menus risk significant fines and the loss of licenses. Despite the risks, prestige continues to make beluga caviar tempting for some buyers. For diners who prefer a legal path, alternatives exist. Varieties such as ostra and savruga remain available for import, and American aquaculture operations raise paddlefish roe and farmed sturgeon that mimic much of the texture and flavor. These options give consumers a chance to enjoy similar delicacies without threatening a species on the edge. Still, among aficionados, no substitute fully carries the cultural weight of beluga, whose scarcity has become part of its legend. It is one example of how U.S. regulation can reshape the foods that reach American tables. And in some cases, the restrictions don't involve wildlife at all, but centuries-old traditions of milk and cheese. Unpasteurized French cheeses. Few products are as tied to French culinary culture as raw milk cheeses. Roquefort, with its sharp blue veins, is one of the best-known examples, representing a tradition that values unpasteurized milk as the key to genuine flavor. But in the United States, many of these cheeses never reach stores because of a long-standing Food and Drug Administration rule. Cheeses made from raw, unpasteurized milk can only be sold or imported if they are aged at least 60 days. That limit is enough to keep some styles legal, but it shuts out many of France's soft, short-aged varieties. The reasoning centers on food safety. Regulators point to pathogens like Listeria and E. coli, which are more likely to survive in fresh, high-moisture cheese and pose greater risks to vulnerable groups such as children, older adults, and pregnant women. Hard cheeses aged beyond the 60-day mark generally pass inspection because drying reduces bacterial growth. But for soft, raw milk cheeses such as Brie de Meaux, Camembert de Normandie, and Epoisses, delicacies best eaten young, the cutoff is impossible to meet. As a result, many of the very cheeses that embody French craftsmanship never make it into American markets. Cheesemakers argue that pasteurization, while protective, strips away microbial diversity and the nuanced flavors that raw milk creates. Advocates say pasteurization reduces that complexity, while regulators maintain that public health outweighs artisanal character. This tension has been debated for years in both trade talks and food policy circles, but the FDA's stance remains firmly focused on risk reduction. In practice, American shops substitute pasteurized versions that imitate French originals but rarely satisfy those who know the difference. Travelers returning from France notice the gap most clearly. What is available at home is not quite the cheese they tasted abroad. And unlike some other banned foods, this restriction isn't likely to relax anytime soon. Sometimes, though, the reasons a food is missing from U.S. shelves have very little to do with safety. Instead, they come from rules about ownership, trade rights, and politics between nations. Mirabelle plums and trade wars. Mirabelle plums look like a simple golden fruit, but getting them in the United States is unusually difficult. Sweet, small, and more candy-like than most produce, they seem harmless at first glance. Their absence from American stores doesn't come from safety concerns or farming limits. Instead, it's a result of trade protections that turn this fruit into a controlled product. In France, Mirabelles are strongly linked to the Lorraine region. The European Union granted them a protected geographical indication, or PGI, meaning only plums grown in that area can be sold under the name Mirabelle de Lorraine. This makes the fruit both an agricultural product and a legally protected brand, because U.S. trade rules don't fully recognize that designation, and because market access is tied to broader agreements, commercial imports to America remain rare or restricted. Farmers in Lorraine retain guaranteed protection, but the price is that most of the fruit never leaves Europe. Trade negotiators have occasionally raised the issue of Mirabelles during larger agricultural discussions. The fruit itself is rarely the centerpiece, but it surfaces alongside broader disputes involving tariffs, subsidies, or labeling standards between the U.S. and Europe. As of 2025, no resolution has been reached that would open up legal retail imports. Compared to battles over steel or aviation, it might sound minor, but it illustrates how geographical protections and market rules can limit what appears in American grocery aisles. For bakers, the gap is obvious. Classic French tarts and jams often rely on the fruit's distinctive flavor, and without access to the real thing, substitutes like American plums or apricots stand in. These replacements echo the appearance but leave the taste lacking, a detail noticed by anyone who has eaten the Lorraine original. Occasional requests still reach specialty importers, but under current law they are unable to fill them. That leaves two options for an American enthusiast: grow a tree for personal use or travel to Lorraine during its short harvest season. Mirabelles serve as a reminder that not every absence on U.S. shelves is about safety. Sometimes, what's kept out has more to do with cultural rules and protected traditions, though in other cases, what's missing is far stranger and far harder to imagine eating at all. Casu Marzu, Italy's Maggot cheese. Casu Marzu is one of Italy's most notorious foods, and it comes from the island of Sardinia. At first, it resembles a typical wheel of pecorino, but this version is left uncovered long enough for flies to lay eggs inside. The resulting larvae break down the cheese as they feed, softening the center into a spreadable paste. For Sardinian families who treat it as a delicacy, the process adds intensity and complexity to the flavor. For regulators, the same process crosses a line into unsafe handling. The presence of live insects is the main point of dispute. Health officials argue that allowing larvae to remain inside creates too many hygiene uncertainties, from possible bacterial growth to the risk of contamination during consumption. Supporters see those larvae as essential to the tradition, but under food standards, the product looks like an obvious warning sign. Regulators highlight both the unsanitary conditions of intentional infestation and the unpredictable nature of leaving a living organism to work on dairy. Because of this, Casu Marzu falls outside EU hygiene rules, making it illegal to sell commercially even within Italy. Families in Sardinia are still allowed to produce and share it privately, keeping the tradition alive on a smaller scale. Internationally, agencies continue to cite it as a clear example of a product too far outside modern food safety codes. In the United States, the Food and Drug Administration has long treated it as prohibited, grouping it with other insect-related foods that cannot be imported or sold. Yet the ban has only added to its reputation. Visitors to Sardinia often seek it out in person, documenting themselves tasting the wriggling cheese and sharing the footage online. Interest from abroad tends to revolve as much around shock as around culinary curiosity, which explains why it continues to generate the same mix of fascination and disgust. While legal substitutes exist for other banned foods, there is nothing comparable to Casu Marzu, leaving its reputation as one of the rarest and most controversial cheeses firmly intact. Other bans come not from hygiene, but from the way animals themselves are treated, where the method of harvest raises as many objections as the product on the plate. Shark fin soup. Shark fin soup has long been seen as a status dish, especially at weddings and banquets in parts of Asia. The broth carries most of the flavor, but the fins give the soup its texture and prestige. In the US, though, the presence of shark fins is treated as a serious offense. State and federal measures from the 2000s through the 2020s have sharply limited their trade, driven by concerns about cruelty and conservation. The controversy rests on how the fins are obtained. Fishermen often cut them off live sharks and discard the bodies, a process called finning. Without their fins, the animals can no longer swim properly and quickly die. The practice has been condemned by marine biologists and animal welfare groups worldwide. In response, the US created a patchwork of restrictions. Federal rules targeted imports and sales, while many states, beginning in the early 2010s, introduced their own ban. By the early 2020s, congressional efforts, including the Shark Fin Sales Elimination Act, had built momentum for a nationwide end to the commerce. Enforcement has grown tighter in recent years. Agencies have reported more seizures and criminal cases tied to fin shipments, often linked to smuggling routes that serve overseas buyers. Even with laws in place, the international demand for shark fin soup sustains a black market. Conservation groups warn that unless international efforts align, US crackdowns will only address one piece of a much larger trade. From a biological standpoint, the case for restrictions is pressing. Global surveys show large-scale declines in shark populations over the last few decades, with several species now critically threatened. Regulators emphasize that protecting sharks helps maintain balance in marine ecosystems and reduces the pressure on species already struggling to recover. Inside the US, some restaurants offer imitation shark fin soup made with gelatin or mushrooms. These alternatives reproduce the texture without the controversy, but they lack the symbolism that gave the original its prestige. And unlike other restricted foods, the spotlight on sharks has made the ban almost unshakable. Yet not every American ban grows from conservation or cruelty. Some exclusions are shaped more by cultural values, where the very idea of eating a certain animal sparks resistance. Horse meat prohibition. In some countries, ordering horse steak is as ordinary as ordering veal or lamb. Markets in France, Belgium, and parts of Italy still sell horse meat without controversy. In the United States, the reaction is markedly different. Here, the proposal stirs strong emotions, and the debate has less to do with flavor than with what horses represent in culture. Legally, eating horse meat is not prohibited at the federal level. What blocks its availability is the practical barrier of inspection. Since the early 2000s, Congress has repeatedly withheld funding for USDA inspections at horse slaughter facilities. Without those inspections, plants cannot operate legally, no matter the demand. The result is a de facto ban. No domestic slaughterhouses exist, and no legal supply chain supports horse meat sales in the U.S. Imports remain negligible. And the combination of regulatory hurdles and cultural attitudes keeps the meat off American table. Supporters of the ongoing restrictions say this makes sense. Horses hold symbolic value in the U.S., from their image as companions in frontier history to their role in sport and recreation today. Unlike cattle or pigs, they occupy a cultural space closer to pets, and many Americans see the idea of eating them as unthinkable. Efforts to reopen slaughterhouses have surfaced more than once, but collapse quickly under public opposition, often facing protests before plans can even take shape. Elsewhere, the perspective is different. In regions of Europe and Asia, horse meat remains part of culinary tradition, sold openly and marketed as a leaner, healthier alternative to beef. Its texture and use span everyday meals and special dishes. But in the U.S., the stigma is too embedded, suggesting a horse-based dish at dinner here is more likely to start an argument than a meal. It's an example of how rules, culture, and emotion can combine to restrict a food that is perfectly legal elsewhere. And sometimes, what gets banned isn't meat at all, but something as unexpected as a piece of candy. Kinder surprise, eggs. To outside visitors, hearing that the United States prohibits a chocolate egg can sound almost absurd. After all, chocolate is everywhere and toys are everywhere, so why not combine them? The product at the center of this rule is the Kinder Surprise egg, a hollow chocolate shell that hides a plastic capsule containing a small toy. In the US, this design has been classified as unsafe for decades. The problem isn't the chocolate or even the toy, but the fact that one is concealed inside the other. The prohibition comes directly from the 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which bars embedding non-edible objects inside food. When that law was written, Congress had child safety in mind, seeking to prevent incidents where small parts could be ingested by mistake. Kinder eggs, which appeared much later in Europe, seem almost built to meet those concerns. Their candy shell tempts children while masking a capsule that can be opened into pieces small enough to swallow. That exact structure is what keeps the product on the FDA's list of banned items. Despite the clear rule, the eggs remain a common seizure item at U.S. borders. Customs regularly seize them from travelers who assume they're harmless souvenirs. Officials have confiscated thousands over the years, treating them seriously under the same standards they apply to other prohibited imports. Regulators consistently point to the law's wording. If food contains hidden non-edible parts, it fails inspection. By 2025, the official workaround is Kinder Joy, a variation designed for legality. Instead of using a hollow chocolate shell, it packages the sweet and the surprise on opposite sides of a single container. One half offers a dessert with a small spoon, while the other holds a separate capsule with the toy. This structure complies with U.S. law by keeping food and object apart. For American fans, it remains the only legal way to enjoy the brand, though some point out that the scaled-back version lacks the novelty of the original. Candy isn't the only familiar treat reshaped by U.S. regulations. The same approach has long transformed products drawn from spices and roots once common in American kitchens. Sassafras root ban. In the 1800s, sassafras root oil was a common household ingredient, used much like cinnamon or cloves. It flavored early versions of root beer, appeared in teas and candies, and even found a place in home remedies. Families often steeped the bark or root into hot drinks and relied on it as part of everyday cooking. For decades, the flavor was tied closely to American tradition until federal scientists raised concerns in the late 20th century. By the 1970s, FDA research had zeroed in on saffrol, the natural compound that gives sassafras its signature aroma. In lab studies, saffrol exposure was linked to liver damage and cancer in animals. As evidence mounted, regulators moved quickly. In 1979, the Food and Drug Administration officially banned sassafras oil and saffrol-containing extracts from being used as flavorings in foods and beverages. What had once been a defining taste of American soda fountains was, almost overnight, reclassified as a public health risk. The ban was specific to saffrol, not the tree itself. Sassafras still grows widely across the eastern United States and continues to play a role in herbal medicine circles. However, anyone selling products with sassafras must either strip out the saffron or carry warnings against ingestion. That regulatory line has left a sharp divide between traditional practices, where the root was prized, and modern standards, which now emphasize risk. Herbalists occasionally argue its benefits, citing digestion or wellness, but regulators maintain that the potential for harm outweighs its history. Commercial beverage makers found substitutes. Today, every American root beer recipe uses saffron-free flavorings to approximate the old taste. The shift preserved the drink itself, but erased the authentic link to the sassafras tree. What once symbolized a homegrown flavor now survives only in imitation. Sassafras shows how a single compound can reshape the fate of an entire food tradition. But not every banned ingredient is so subtle. Some restrictions involve fruits that look inviting yet conceal dangers that regulators refuse to overlook. Fresh Ackee fruit restrictions. Ackee is one of the few fruits that can be both a celebrated national ingredient and a regulated hazard. With its red pod and glossy black seeds, it looks like a tropical curiosity until you learn its risk. If eaten before the pod opens naturally, the flesh contains high levels of hypoglycin, a toxin that prevents the body from regulating blood sugar. In Jamaica, this condition is known as Jamaican vomiting sickness, a reaction that can cause severe illness and in rare cases be fatal. Despite that danger, Ackee remains at the heart of Jamaica's culinary identity. Ackee and saltfish is the national dish, served in homes, restaurants, and festivals throughout the country. Generations have passed down the knowledge of how to handle the fruit. Never force it open, discard the black seeds, and eat only the naturally exposed yellow flesh inside. This cultural experience has allowed Jamaicans to keep enjoying the fruit, even as regulators elsewhere continue to treat it with strict caution. In the US, the problem has always been ensuring consistent safety. Fresh Ackee cannot be imported, and the FDA has enforced that prohibition since the 1970s because there is no reliable way to inspect unopened pods for dangerous levels of hypoglycin. Customs agencies screen for it regularly, and seizures of fresh fruit in luggage or shipments underline that the rule is backed by active enforcement. From a regulatory standpoint, the risk of unpredictable toxicity outweighs the appeal of bringing fresh pods directly to market. What has emerged instead is a compromise. By 2025, canned and frozen Ackee products are permitted in the US, provided they have been processed and tested under approved international standards to keep hypoglycin levels within safe limits. These versions give American consumers the chance to try the dish legally, and they preserve Jamaica's ability to share its cultural staple abroad. Caribbean restaurants across the US depend on these imports, serving Ackee with saltfish in a way that reflects tradition while satisfying regulators. Other traditional foods face a different obstacle. Not plant toxins, but long-standing rules about which animal parts Americans can put on their plates. Black pudding bans. Black pudding often confuses outsiders with its name, but it isn't a dessert at all. It's a traditional blood sausage with deep roots in the United Kingdom and Ireland. A staple of cooked breakfasts, especially in Scotland, it's typically made from pig's blood, fat, oatmeal, and spices, creating a dense, savory texture. Some regional recipes also incorporate organ meats for added depth, including lungs, and that detail is exactly where American regulations step in. Since 1971, the Food and Drug Administration has enforced rules that prohibit the use of animal lungs in food products. Officials argue that lung tissue can retain fluids and contaminants that are difficult to inspect, making it impossible to guarantee safety. While not every black pudding recipe includes lung, traditional varieties that do are automatically excluded from US markets under this rule. This connection places authentic regional versions, like Stornoway black pudding from Scotland, which also carries protected geographical indication, PGI status, firmly off-limits to American consumers. Nevertheless, the dish survives in adapted forms across US communities with British or Irish heritage. Butchers and small producers make lung-free sausages that rely strictly on blood, cereal, and spices. These versions are legal and provide a reasonable substitute, though many enthusiasts note they clearly lack the depth of traditional blends. Purists summarize the issue simply. American versions remove disallowed ingredients. Authentic flavor is lost. For those who grew up eating black pudding abroad, the substitutes are familiar in texture, yet incomplete in essence. Cultural groups and food advocates have occasionally tried to carve out exceptions, arguing for the dish's heritage value. As of 2025, however, no such appeals have led to change. The federal regulation remains intact, and imports of lung-containing versions are blocked. For now, Americans who want to replicate the experience must rely on modified recipes or travel overseas to enjoy the genuine article. This isn't the only case where blood-based dishes run into U.S. restrictions. In other parts of the world, sausages aren't the format of choice. Sometimes the tradition takes the form of a street snack served on a stick. Pig's blood cake. In Taiwan, pig's blood cake, known locally as *taihoko*, stands out as one of the country's most iconic night market snacks. It's made by combining sticky rice with pig's blood, steaming the mixture until firm and cutting it into blocks for easy serving. Vendors often skewer the pieces, coat them with crushed peanuts, add fresh cilantro, and brush on a sweet soy glaze. The result is chewy, filling, and deeply tied to the everyday food culture of Taiwanese street life. Its cultural role is straightforward. Blood cake is a practical food that reflects resourcefulness, using parts of the animal that might otherwise be discarded. To many locals, eating it isn't adventurous at all. It's familiar, affordable, and comforting. Travelers often describe it as a highlight, but in Taiwan, it is simply one more ordinary choice among others. In the United States, however, pig's blood cake falls under prohibitions. The Food and Drug Administration generally bans most products made with animal blood from commercial sale or import because of the elevated pathogen risks. Regulators argue that blood can carry bacteria and viruses at levels that are difficult to monitor reliably during processing. Without strict inspection systems in place, agencies classify it as too unsafe to permit in food commerce. That leaves pig's blood cake off-limits in restaurants, grocery stores, or food trucks. Regardless of cultural interest or demand, there are limited exceptions. Certain blood-based products, such as some varieties of blood sausage, can exist legally in the U.S. if they are produced under USDA inspection in facilities that meet federal safety standards. But the informal, handmade style that defines Taiwanese pigs blood cake has no path under those rules, so the authentic version remains inaccessible outside of private or underground attempts. This example shows how cultural staples can be defined as off-limits not by intent, but by the regulatory weight of safety codes. And in some cases, those codes also collide with foods that attract as much curiosity as they do discomfort. Items banned for health reasons that continue to capture worldwide attention. Casu Marzu Revisited. This section presents a clear structural problem. It carries the title Casu Marzu Revisited, yet the content underneath repeats material on Kinder Surprise eggs, which we already covered earlier. Without introducing new information, the section feels redundant and breaks the script's pacing. The best solution is to correct the mislabel and remove this duplication entirely. If the intent was to return to Casu Marzu, that material already received full coverage earlier, and repetition here would add little value. If the intent was to spotlight another missing banned food, that would require replacing the content wholesale with a researched alternative. Since no new, research-supported food has been provided at this point in the script, the most effective editorial fix is to cut the entire section. Eliminating it smooths the narrative, avoids redundancy, and keeps the runtime lean. It also allows the script to transition cleanly into the next section, which examines another food item with evolving restrictions. What remains is a tighter sequence. Rather than lingering on repeated examples, we move naturally into the next case where regulatory focus has shifted over time. This keeps the audience engaged and establishes momentum for the discussion that follows. Ackee fruit revisited. Ackee remains one of the few banned foods where U.S. policy has shifted rather than staying frozen in place. When the fruit was first targeted in the early 1970s, federal regulators applied a full stop to fresh imports. The concern was hypoglycin, a naturally occurring toxin in unripe pods that can cause Jamaican vomiting sickness, a condition marked by dangerous drops in blood sugar. That ban still holds today, keeping fresh pods firmly out of the country. The compromise has come through preserved versions. Canned and frozen ackee are permitted under strict FDA oversight, provided each shipment is tested to confirm toxin levels fall within safe limits. These products are what supply Caribbean restaurants in the U.S., allowing dishes like ackee and saltfish to appear on menus without requiring workarounds. For communities connected to the fruit, this legal channel means tradition and identity can be maintained while regulators ensure safety. Travelers, however, often discover the rules remain strict at airports, as customs officers routinely confiscate fresh pods no matter how carefully they've been packed or how ripe they appear. What has evolved over time is the degree of accountability on canned imports. In 2025, the FDA expanded labeling requirements, making sure packaging carries clear information about the fruit's risks as well as assurances that contents have passed inspection. Regulators want consumers to understand the history of toxicity, even if the processed versions are considered safe. To Jamaican exporters, this balance has been worthwhile, as it secures access to the U.S. market while preserving consumer confidence. Ackee demonstrates that bans are not always absolute. Sometimes they adapt to weigh cultural importance against safety concerns. But not all foods receive that compromise. In some cases, regulators build multiple barriers to ensure enforcement, strengthening restrictions where loopholes might exist. Shark fins double ban. Shark fins are one of the clearest examples of how U.S. food restrictions now operate on two levels at once. Federal rules tightened through the 2000s and 2010s, restricting imports and sales nationwide, but many states went further by passing their own prohibitions. Together, these overlapping measures closed nearly every gap in the market. In several states, even possessing fins without proof of legal exemption can trigger penalties, ensuring there is virtually no legal path to distribute the product. This layered approach wasn't about symbolism, it came from practical enforcement needs. Smugglers often tried to exploit inconsistencies, moving fins through states that lacked strict penalties. State legislatures responded by mirroring or exceeding federal limits, making transportation and resale impossible regardless of route. The result was a near-total market closure, with both state and federal agencies able to intercept illegal shipment. Enforcement has increased steadily, with seizures and prosecutions rising at ports in places like California, Florida, and New York, long considered major entry points for seafood commodity. Law enforcement notes that fins occupy a peculiar spot in the contraband trade. The product is light, compact, and extremely valuable, which makes it easier to traffic than many other banned goods. Investigations have linked smuggling rings to wider criminal networks, and advocates argue that eliminating the U.S. market is one way to weaken demand. Conservationists also continue to stress the ecological impacts of the fin trade, though those arguments were central to the earlier bans rather than this enforcement phase. Here, the focus is less on debate and more on closing off loopholes that once kept the trade alive. For cultural communities that once viewed shark fin soup as a ceremonial dish, the change has been sharp. Restaurants and caterers now turn to vegetarian substitutes, often made with gelatin, tofu, or mushrooms to recreate the prized texture. While these alternatives lack the symbolic weight of the original, they remain the only legal option on offer. Some restricted foods, however, never fade into obscurity. One banned delicacy in particular continues to attract attention for its status and rarity long after its removal from the U.S. market. Beluga Caviar Redux. Beluga Caviar has remained a point of fascination long after its removal from U.S. markets. Its reputation as the peak of luxury dining keeps it discussed among chefs and fine dining circles, even though official imports have been off the table since federal authorities enacted the 2005 ban. The eggs come from the beluga sturgeon, a massive fish once abundant in the Caspian and Black Seas, but now reduced to critically low number. Conservation efforts have yet to bring populations back to stability, and with little sign of recovery, restrictions remain firmly in place. The biology of the beluga adds another layer to the challenge. Unlike many species, female beluga sturgeon mature exceptionally slowly. It can take 15 to 20 years before they begin producing eggs, and some do not spawn until closer to 25. This lengthy timeline means that every mature fish removed from the population sets recovery back by decades. Aquaculture experiments attempted in Europe and elsewhere struggled against the same biological limit. Production cycles stretched far longer than markets could tolerate, and costs consistently outweighed yields. Farming never scaled to meet demand, leaving pressure to fall back on dwindling wild stocks. Today, legal alternatives, such as ostra, savruga, and American paddlefish roe, supply caviar to U.S. restaurants and retailers. These products deliver similar textures and flavors, offering diners a more affordable option without the ecological toll. Yet among purists, nothing carries the same cultural weight as beluga. Its scarcity has contributed to its legend, and for some, the idea of tasting it remains as much about exclusivity as it is about cuisine. Attempts to substitute often invite comparison rather than satisfaction, which explains why conversations about beluga still surface despite its absence from the market. The enduring fascination with beluga illustrates how biology, policy, and cultural prestige intertwine to shape the status of a single food. It underlines the point that when regulators target a delicacy, the reasons are often as much about long-term survival as immediate safety, an issue that becomes even more stark with foods considered dangerous not for ecosystems, but for human life itself. Japanese puffer fish, better known as fugu, has long been one of the most feared and respected foods in the world. The risk comes from tetrodotoxin, a neurotoxin concentrated in the fish's organs, especially the liver and ovaries. Just a trace amount can cause paralysis or even death, and studies suggest a single fish can hold enough poison to kill several adults. That danger makes preparing fugu far more than ordinary cooking. In Japan, only chefs with licenses earned through years of training are allowed to serve it. Their instruction focuses on carefully separating the edible flesh and avoiding cross-contamination during preparation. The examination to qualify is strict, and very few applicants succeed. This system ensures that the dish, though hazardous, is treated seriously both as a delicacy and as a professional responsibility. For the United States, the controls are even tighter. Unprocessed puffer fish is not permitted for import at all. The only exception comes through certified processors in Japan who remove the toxic parts, freeze the edible flesh, and prepare it under standards approved by both Japanese authorities and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Only in this treated form can it legally cross into American market. The FDA monitors these shipments closely, so the limited supply available in the United States reaches only a handful of restaurants willing to manage the regulations and liability that come with it. As of 2025, the policy has not changed. Fugu remains one of the rarest dishes on U.S. menus. Adventurous diners who want the thrill of the traditional experience often travel abroad, especially to Tokyo, where licensed chefs serve it as sashimi or hot pot in tightly controlled settings. Eating it in America usually means sampling a far smaller, heavily regulated supply. While fugu's danger lies in its natural toxins, other foods are restricted for very different reasons, some connected less to preparation and more to concerns about the diseases carried by the animals themselves. Bushmeat ban. Bushmeat is not a single animal, but a broad category of wild game taken from forests in parts of Africa. The term includes everything from small antelopes and porcupines to monkeys, fruit bats, and even other primates. In rural regions, bushmeat has long been both a vital source of protein and a marker of tradition. Once it enters international trade, however, U.S. regulators classify it as a clear hazard and treat it with zero tolerance. Imports of bushmeat remain strictly prohibited. The strongest justification is public health. Handling and consuming wild animals can transmit dangerous viruses, some of which have been tied to serious outbreaks. Authorities cite past examples, such as Ebola, as justification for keeping bushmeat out of circulation, given the risk of pathogens surviving transport inside dried or frozen cuts. Even small amounts carried in luggage are treated as threats, since viruses need very little to spread. For agencies like the FDA and the Centers for Disease Control, this possibility is enough to enforce a hard ban regardless of packaging or presentation. Smuggling attempts still happen, but enforcement has tightened. Customs officers at U.S. airports and seaports continue to intercept shipments or passenger luggage containing bushmeat, and penalties can be severe. Fines reach into the tens of thousands of dollars, and criminal charges are possible for larger violations. These laws are meant to deter any importation, reinforcing the position that bushmeat's health risks are too serious to overlook. The ban is not only about people's safety, but also about conservation. Many bushmeat species are already threatened by deforestation and habitat loss, and subsistence hunting adds further strain. Primates, in particular, face steep population declines when traded for food. Regulators cite this ecological harm as an added reason to block any legal import path. While diaspora communities in the U.S. may wish for familiar dishes tied to bushmeat, the balance of public health and endangered species protection leaves the prohibition firmly in place. From a federal perspective, foods with high cultural importance are still subject to exclusion when risks are deemed too high. In other cases, bans stem not from pathogens or conservation, but from rules surrounding ingredients inside oils or spices. Mustard oil restrictions. Mustard oil has long been a cornerstone of Indian cooking, especially in Bengal, where it brings a sharp, pungent bite to fried fish, pickles, and curries. Generations of households across northeastern India treat it as essential, an ingredient tied as much to culture as to flavor. Its intense edge is difficult to reproduce with more neutral oils, which is why its absence in the U.S. stands out so strongly. Yet on American store shelves, mustard oil carries an unusual label, for external use only. The reason has nothing to do with tradition and everything to do with chemistry. The issue is erucic acid, a naturally occurring compound in mustard oil. Decades of laboratory studies suggested that consuming oils high in erucic acid could strain the heart and cause lesions in animals. Even though evidence in humans has been less definitive, U.S. regulators treated the findings seriously. The Food and Drug Administration never approved mustard oil for food use, meaning it cannot be marketed as an edible product. As a result, bottles sold in the U.S. are restricted to use for massage, skincare, or hair treatment, with clear labels warning against culinary use. Still, for many immigrant families, the restriction leaves a gap. At home, some cooks continue to incorporate mustard oil into traditional recipes despite the warning on the label, choosing to preserve the flavor central to Bengali cooking. This practice is anecdotal and unofficial. Restaurants tend to avoid it because of liability, and major retailers carry only the non-food versions. The ingredient's cultural weight remains heavy, even as supermarkets fill their aisles with safer substitutes. Policy has not shifted in recent years. In 2025, the FDA still cites the same erucic acid studies as justification for keeping the restriction in place. Canola and vegetable oils dominate legal sales, but for those who grew up with mustard oil, the flavor gap is obvious. Dishes like Bengali fish curry or spicy achar lose the fiery intensity that defines them, leaving substitutions close but never exact. From pungent oils to other delicacies prized abroad, the reasoning behind U.S. restrictions often extends into areas where scarcity, contamination fears, and cultural value collide. Bird nest soup. Bird nest soup is unlike anything else served at a banquet table. Instead of twigs or straw, the so-called nests are made almost entirely from the hardened saliva of swiftlets, small cave-dwelling birds found in parts of Southeast Asia. When harvested and simmered in broth, the nests dissolve into a gelatin-like texture. For centuries, this dish has been consumed as a tonic tied to health, vitality, and prosperity, which helped secure its reputation as one of the priciest luxury dishes in Asia. In Hong Kong and mainland China, bird nest soup became a symbol of refinement, often appearing at grand banquets or holiday celebrations. The taste itself is subtle, almost neutral, but the cultural weight far exceeds the flavor. Ordering it signals tradition, wealth, and status, the qualities that make it a dish more about its history than its seasoning. For the United States, though, the response has been sharply different. Regulators block imports mainly over disease concerns such as avian influenza and contamination, so commercial imports are restricted and customs have seized shipments for decades. Cave-collected nests raise red flags because they can carry droppings, mold, and pathogens that survive drying and transport. With sources tied to wild bird environments, the FDA and U.S. health agencies maintain that the risk is too great to allow them into food markets. Enforcement has been firm. Customs officers regularly report seizing hidden nests in passenger luggage or in undeclared shipments, treating them the same way they treat unapproved exotic animal products. Officials categorize them as potential vectors for disease, placing prevention ahead of consumer interest. Health agencies consistently cite avian influenza as the leading reason for keeping the ban intact, describing it as a threat not worth the gamble. For Americans curious to try it, the only options are artificial substitutes, clear soups that mimic the gelatin-like look but not the cultural authenticity. Abroad, bird nest soup remains a luxury marker, while in the US it has never made it past the border. Other foods closely linked to heritage face similar restrictions, especially traditional cheeses that fall short of US aging rule. Epoisses cheese. Epoisses is a cheese with a reputation that arrives long before the first bite. Made in the Burgundy region of France, it is washed repeatedly in brandy as it ages, developing both a creamy texture and a famously pungent aroma. To some, it is irresistible, to others overwhelming, but for enthusiasts, it represents the height of French cheesemaking. In the United States, though, it never makes it past the border. The issue isn't the smell, it's the method. Epoisses is traditionally produced with raw milk and aged only about 60 days, which puts it on the wrong side of American rules. The FDA requires all cheeses made with unpasteurized milk to be aged at least 60 days before they can be sold. That benchmark was chosen decades ago, under the assumption that harmful bacteria like Listeria, Salmonella, or E. coli would not survive in harder, drier cheeses as they lost moisture over time. Soft cheeses such as Epoisses, however, remain moist even after reaching that 60-day mark, leaving U.S. regulators unconvinced that the process reliably eliminates pathogens. As a result, these raw milk versions are blocked from import, along with several other traditional European soft cheeses. Fans argue that this restriction strips the product of the very qualities that make it distinctive. The flavor of Epoisses comes directly from the raw milk microbes and the repeated brandy washes that create its gooey center and strong rind. Pasteurizing the milk and adjusting the recipe produces something that might approximate the original but not equal it. For cheesemakers and consumers alike, the ban represents more than the loss of a product. It closes a channel of cultural exchange with deep regional roots. In the United States, substitutes appear on specialty shop shelves under modified names or adapted recipes. These provide curious buyers a sense of Epoisses' intensity, but for those who have experienced the original, the difference is obvious. Appeals from European producers to make exceptions have surfaced over the years, but the FDA continues to point back to documented foodborne illness outbreaks tied to soft raw milk cheeses as justification for keeping the prohibition in place. By 2025, Epoisses remains firmly excluded from American markets, its authenticity available only overseas. And while some bans focus on microbes in cheese, others exist because of something far smaller. Tiny pests hidden in a crop that seems, at first glance, completely harmless. Indian rice ban. Rice imports from India have faced U.S. scrutiny for decades, not because of quality or safety in cooking, but because of a tiny pest with outsized potential for destruction, the copra beetle. This small brown insect is considered one of the most damaging stored grain pests in the world. It feeds not only on rice, but also on wheat, oats, barley, and other stored foods. The copra beetle can devastate grain reserves and is extremely difficult to eradicate once established, which is why imports from some sources have been restricted historically to guard against agricultural infestation. The problem is resilience. Copra beetles can survive long periods without food, hide deep in storage crevices, and resist many standard pest control measures. Even a small, unnoticed population can spread quickly. In the mid-20th century, U.S. inspections caught infestations in rice shipments, underscoring just how easily the pest could cross borders. Regulators concluded that allowing untreated shipments to enter the country could threaten the Midwest's massive grain reserves and cost agriculture millions. To prevent that scenario, U.S. authorities implemented strict restrictions on certain types and sources of Indian rice. Enforcement has been consistent ever since. Customs officers regularly target rice shipments from regions flagged for higher copra beetle risk. Because the insect's eggs are nearly invisible and can survive sealed packaging, visual inspection alone is unreliable. That led to rules designed around precaution. Restrict imports before they enter rather than try to contain an outbreak later. While India remains one of the largest rice exporters globally, sending millions of tons to Europe, Asia, and Africa. The U.S. maintains tighter barriers, leaving its consumers reliant on domestically grown varieties or rice imported from countries like Thailand and Pakistan. As of 2025, restrictions remain in place for certain shipments and types of rice linked to copper beetle concerns. The pest is still listed as a high-priority agricultural threat, keeping India's exports to the U.S. limited in spite of demand. This reflects how far American policy will go when crop security is at stake. And in other instances, protection extends not just to plants or stored grains, but to animals once consumed as staples of global diet. Say, turtle meat. For centuries, sea turtle meat was a staple across the Caribbean, valued not only as food for local communities, but also as provisions for sailors during long voyages. Stews made from green turtle meat were common, and salted or smoked cuts kept well at sea. In addition to food, turtles were harvested for oil and shells, which made them a widespread commodity. That era has long ended, replaced by one of the clearest examples of how global conservation directly shapes what people are allowed to eat. Today, every recognized sea turtle species is listed as threatened or endangered. Decades of harvesting adults for meat, raiding nests for eggs, and poaching hawksbill shells for jewelry pushed populations toward collapse. Habitat loss from development and coastal fishing pressures compounded the decline. By the late 20th century, conservation groups worldwide were calling for comprehensive bans to prevent the complete disappearance of these reptiles. In the United States, the response was decisive and layered in law. Sea turtles are fully protected under the Endangered Species Act, making it illegal to kill, sell, or possess them. The Lacey Act, which covers the trafficking of protected wildlife, imposes additional penalties for trade, while international agreements such as CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, extend enforcement to the global level. Taken together, these tools closed every legal avenue for importing or selling sea turtle meat in America. Unlike some restricted foods that occupy a regulatory gray area, this one is prohibited outright. Some Caribbean nations have granted limited cultural exemptions, allowing controlled local harvests tied to tradition. These allowances are small and shrinking, reflecting the urgency of species recovery. By contrast, the United States maintains zero tolerance, with customs officers empowered to seize any suspected products and prosecute violations with steep fines or criminal charges. By 2025, the idea of eating sea turtle meat in America is no longer a matter of debate. It is effectively erased from the market. Yet not all prohibited foods are tied to endangered animals. In some cases, bans come from hidden risks inside ingredients that appear far more ordinary at first glance. Tonka beans! Tonka beans may look like little more than dark, glossy seeds, but their fragrance sets them apart. Break one open, and you'll find an aroma that hovers between vanilla, almond, cinnamon, and clove. That complexity has made them prized additions in places like France and South America, where chefs grate them lightly over ice cream or infuse them into custards. Bartenders, too, experiment with them in cocktails for their layered warmth. Abroad, they are treated as subtle, sophisticated accents. In the United States, however, they remain firmly on the banned list. The issue comes down to coumarin, a natural compound found inside the beans. Experiments in the mid-20th century showed that high doses of coumarin could cause liver damage and internal bleeding in animals. In 1954, the Food and Drug Administration responded by banning tonka beans outright from food service. Since then, regardless of culinary interest, they have not been permitted in American kitchens. Chefs abroad argue that the culinary amounts used are tiny, mere shavings that provide fragrance without approaching toxic levels. A single bean can last through several recipes, ensuring that no dish contains more than a trace. Even with those assurances, the FDA has never changed its position. Regulators emphasize the scientific record. Coumarin has clear toxicity in high doses, and the safest move is to keep tonka beans out of food entirely. The ban has held for over 70 years, with no sign of reversal. In the absence of the real thing, American cooks rely on substitutes. Blends of vanilla, almond extract, and warming spices aim to approximate tonka's unusual profile, but devotees note that the result never fully matches the depth of the original bean. For adventurous chefs, tonka remains a reminder of the distance between culinary tradition and American regulation, a flavor admired elsewhere, but unavailable here. Restrictions like this highlight how U.S. law applies even to the smallest of ingredients. Other bans, however, target not spices or oils but entire animals, whose preparation and consumption raise questions of conservation, ethics, and national law. Ortolan, the forbidden bird. The ortolan bunting is a bird so small it can rest in the palm of a hand, yet it became one of the most controversial dishes ever linked to French cuisine. Traditionally, hunters trapped them at night when the tiny songbirds were easier to catch. After capture, they were fattened in darkness until ready to prepare. The cooking method that followed was stark. The birds were drowned in brandy, roasted whole, and eaten in a single bite, bones included. Diners sometimes covered their faces with a napkin during the act, a gesture noted in accounts but criticized as much for its severity as for symbolism. By the late 20th century, growing concern over both cruelty and conservation pushed governments to intervene. Populations of ortolans had dropped sharply, and the practice drew widespread criticism. France outlawed hunting and serving the birds in the 1990s, but enforcement tightened further with European Union protections, which listed the species to be safeguarded across member states. By the 2000s, these moves established that catching ortolans was no longer just frowned upon, but explicitly illegal across Europe. Illegal poaching did continue for a time, often in rural areas where the tradition had long roots, but enforcement efforts expanded in response. France introduced heavier penalties, and monitoring of habitats became more active. Seizures and prosecutions have grown stricter with every passing decade, signaling far less tolerance than before. While a few reports still surface of high-profile individuals privately tasting the dish, enforcement leaves little room for anything beyond rumor. International law also reinforced the prohibition. The United States, aligning with migratory bird protections and agreements like CITES, classified the ortolan among protected species, making its import or sale illegal. Together, these laws position the bird as a symbol of how tradition gave way to conservation priority. As of 2025, the ortolan ban in both Europe and America is firmly in place. What once lived on as a hidden indulgence is now best known as an example of shifting food norms, a reminder that cultural attachment does not outweigh modern legal protections. And while this debate reached its end in Europe, other food controversies in America continue to stall without resolution. Horse meat revisited. Horse meat is one of those foods that highlights just how different cultural perspectives can be. In much of Europe, cuts of horse steak are sold openly in butcher shops, viewed much like beef or veal and valued for being lean and slightly sweet. In the United States, however, the subject remains frozen in place. Unlike other banned foods tied to safety or conservation, the horse meat issue stems from a mix of legal mechanics and cultural resistance. At the federal level, there is no law prohibiting Americans from eating horse meat. The barrier comes from the way slaughterhouses are regulated. Since the early 2000s, Congress has routinely blocked funding for U.S. Department of Agriculture inspections of horse slaughter facilities. Because every meat plant requires USDA inspection to operate legally, this funding restriction effectively shut the industry down. Without inspection authority, no commercial horse processing can occur, leaving the country with no domestic supply. While technically not an outright ban, it operates the same way in practice. Importing horse meat has also proven difficult. Although nations like France and Belgium treat the product as ordinary, U.S. regulators remain reluctant to approve large-scale imports. Safety oversight plays a role, but public ethics shape the stronger barrier. Culturally, horses in America are linked to companionship, work, and sport, from the frontier period to modern equestrian tradition. They are considered companions more than livestock, and any suggestion of placing them on the dinner table immediately runs into political outrage and resistance. By contrast, European nations raise and process horses like other farm animals, selling cuts alongside beef and pork with little controversy. The sharp difference reveals how bans are not always about health risks, but about cultural framing. Americans tend to imagine horses in fields, stables, or racetracks, not butcher shops. That perception alone maintains the stalemate. As of 2025, there is no movement in Washington to reverse the funding block. Advocacy groups continue to campaign for permanent legal prohibitions, while a small camp of ranchers argue for reopening the market. So far, both sides remain gridlocked. And while horses embody this cultural divide, other animals gain protection in U.S. law for a very different reason. They are seen less as food and more as untouchable symbols of grace. Swan protections. Swans hold a special place in American law, not as food, but as a species placed firmly under protection. In the United States, hunting, selling, or consuming swans is prohibited under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which safeguards species that cross international borders. This rule applies not only to the birds themselves, but also to their eggs, which means collecting them is treated as a violation identical to killing the adult animal. Their historical status tells a very different story. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, swans were once raised on royal estates and occasionally served at banquets to display wealth and privilege. That image of roasted swan persisted among the aristocracy, but the tradition never established itself in America. By the time the young nation was forming, swans were far more likely to appear in poetry, folklore, or painting than on a dinner plate. Modern U.S. protections emphasize their cultural and ecological roles instead of their edibility. Agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service enforce the law with vigilance. Game wardens monitor nesting areas during breeding season, ensuring eggs are not taken and birds are not disturbed. Even a single illegally harvested egg can trigger fines and prosecution. The law's reach reflects the seriousness with which the federal government treats migratory bird protection. The protections also extend to recovery efforts. Trumpeter swans, once near extinction in the United States, have slowly rebuilt their numbers thanks to strict protections, wetland preservation, and controlled reintroduction programs. Allowing harvest for food would undo decades of progress that brought their populations back from the brink. For regulators, the choice is clear. Conservation takes priority, and swans stay off the menu. As of 2025, there is no indication that these rules will change. Swans are viewed as untouchable under federal law, their survival valued over any curiosity about their taste. And while the protections around swans are widely accepted, the next example is far more divisive, where questions of culinary tradition and animal welfare collide in ongoing legal battle. Foie gras controversy. Foie gras stands out as one of the most polarizing foods in the United States. Chefs and diners who support it argue that it represents the peak of French culinary tradition, prized for its rich, buttery texture and long heritage. Opponents, particularly animal welfare groups, condemn it as unnecessary and cruel. The controversy comes from how it is made. Ducks and geese are force-fed over several weeks to enlarge their livers, producing the distinctive flavor and texture. To fans, it is a rare delicacy. To critics, it is industrialized abuse. The debate has not remained in kitchens or newspapers, but has spilled directly into law. California has been the most prominent example, enacting restrictions that ban the production and sale of foie gras within the state. Almost immediately, lawsuits followed from restaurants and chefs who claimed such laws erased an important piece of cultural heritage. The result was years of courtroom battles at both state and federal levels, with each ruling shifting legal boundaries but never fully settling the issue. The litigation itself became part of the story, underscoring that foie gras in America is as much about politics and ethics as it is about food. By 2025, the outcome is still unsettled. No national ban exists, but access continues to be fractured. Some states permit foie gras freely, while others maintain restrictions, producing a patchwork of rules across the map. For chefs working in jurisdictions where it remains legal, foie gras stays on luxury tasting menus. In regions where the bans hold, it is absent altogether, regardless of demand. Imports from France, the world's leading supplier, are also heavily regulated, keeping American supply controlled and limited. Availability varies by state. Check local law if you're curious about whether it appears on menus near you. The dispute shows no signs of disappearing. Animal welfare advocates continue to push for new bans through legislation and public campaigns, while defenders in the restaurant world repeatedly frame the product as culinary heritage in need of protection. Its contested status keeps foie gras in constant debate, making it one of America's most enduring food controversies. Even as those arguments unfold, attention is turning toward another category of food under scrutiny: products prized for being raw and natural that face their own long-standing restrictions. Raw and unpasteurized foods. Raw and unpasteurized foods remain some of the most tightly controlled items in the American food system. Raw milk and many unpasteurized cheeses are at the center of this debate. Raw milk may be legal in some states, but it cannot cross state lines for sale, while raw milk cheeses must meet the FDA's 60-day aging rule before they are cleared for interstate commerce. This creates a patchwork system where local access varies, but nationwide standards keep restrictions firmly in place. The FDA and CDC point to repeated outbreaks of foodborne illness as justification for those limits. Unpasteurized milk has been linked to clusters of E. coli, salmonella, and listeria infections year after year. Pasteurization eliminates most of those risks, but without it, regulators say the odds of contamination are too high to justify widespread availability. That is why federal law continues to block raw milk from legal interstate sales, and why imports of soft raw milk cheeses are so uncommon. Unless a cheese meets the 60-day requirement and inspection standards, it rarely passes customs. Supporters of raw dairy see things differently. They argue that raw products retain living microbes that can offer digestive or probiotic benefits, claiming the flavors and textures are richer and more distinctive than pasteurized versions. Farmers in states that allow raw milk often frame its sale as part of preserving natural, traditional food practices, while regulatory agencies continue to emphasize public safety first. The divide keeps consumer demand alive in some regions, even when laws are restrictive. As of 2025, federal guidance has not softened. Labels on legal raw dairy products carry clear health warnings, and states without authorization continue to enforce outright bans. In areas where the gray market operates, private buying clubs and shares provide a workaround, but the risks and restrictions remain significant. For consumers, the practical reality is simple. Whether or not raw dairy is available depends entirely on where you live. Those differences in access underline a broader theme. What you can eat in the United States still depends as much on regulation as on demand. Food restrictions in the U.S. reveal more than just dietary rules. They show how safety concerns, conservation goals, and trade politics shape what ends up on the table. From lungs in Scottish haggis to raw milk French cheeses, beluga caviar, or even kinder surprise eggs, every case shows a collision between culture and regulation. What one country treats as tradition, another may classify as risk. The takeaway is simple. America blocks foods for three main reasons: health, conservation, or international trade. Which example surprised you most? Let us know in the comments and subscribe for more odd stories of food and law. Food tells culture stories, and sometimes the law answers back.